Today, we are talking about historical fiction. In this video, I am going to tell you everything that I would have wanted to know about a year ago when I started writing my first historical fiction novel. Since then, I have drafted one historical fiction novel and also written a historical fiction play, and this one is all about how do you research if you are writing historical fiction. There are sort of three steps that I want to go over. The first one is about deciding what kind of historical fiction you're going to be writing and defining what sort of research you need to do. Then I'm going to be talking about doing the research, and then I'm going to be talking about documenting the research. So let's get right into it. There is not one kind of historical fiction. On one end of the spectrum, we have what I think of as characters chilling in a time period. We see this a lot with historical romances and with westerns, that sort of thing, where we have characters, they're in some time period, but there's not usually a year given. The characters are completely made up. There's really no references to external or real events. They're just in a different time period where the customs and traditions of that time period fuel the conflict that we're dealing with. An example of this would be Bridgerton. We know it's the Edwardian era, but there's a few things that are kind of different from reality to it. We're not seeing many real historical figures. On the other side of the spectrum, we have something like The Crown or the books by Philippa Gregory, where the plot of the story is inherently tied to real events. So in The Crown, in the books by Philippa Gregory, we are following real historical figures. So this follows very closely, although it's still fiction, the actual lives and minutiae of events. It's like fictional retelling of real stuff. Now in the middle, this is a spectrum, right? So most things are not going to be all the way over here or all the way over here. Most things will kind of fall somewhere on this spectrum. So for Downton Abbey, we are dealing with a made-up family. However, there are certain events, the sinking of the Titanic, World War I, certain battles of World War I, things in the 20s, and once or twice they might have a real historical figure as a house guest. But most of the plot elements, the family of the story, is separate. This spectrum I think is super important, and this is a spectrum that I keep in my head. I have heard people say it's not a good idea to write historical fiction about real people. No, that's not true. You're perfectly able to do that. It's not a good idea to not have a year in mind. No, you don't necessarily have to have a year in mind if you're on this end of the spectrum. Where it gets really important and what the sort of crux of it is how much freedom you have to manipulate the plot and how much research you really need to do. Because if you're over here, you're going to be doing a lot more research than if you're over here. There's never a case where the setting doesn't influence the plot, but how much reality influences the plot is really important to understand. If you are writing The Crown or a Philippa Gregory book, you cannot do anything until you have done your research. Now, you don't have to be 100% accurate in the book, but you have to know historically what actually happened. In The Crown, in season 4, there's an episode where they go to Balmoral Castle. It's called the Balmoral Test. And they're in the episode, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, comes up to Balmoral and she's like, this is so dumb, I don't want to be here. And then Diana comes up and she scores brilliantly and everyone's like, this is the perfect wife for you. In the episode, this is done in the same weekend. Obviously, in real life, probably not the same weekend, probably not even the same year. But the creators had to do the research to understand what really happened. And then they were able to manipulate the timelines a little bit, to manipulate the timelines and change things so they could serve the plot of the show. So, in my own experience, my book 1837 falls sort of in the middle around the Downton Abbey area, maybe a little further this way, because I've really had to sort of dive into the figures that were operating at the time and the timeline of events, like was it on the December 3rd or December 4th that X happened. However, it follows mainly fictional characters. I wrote a play, however, about Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. If you don't know, Alfred Russel Wallace basically came up with the theory of natural selection. It wasn't exactly the same theory. He was looking at a slightly different pressure. He sent a letter to Charles Darwin from the Malayan archipelago and said, "Look at my cool new theory, Mr. Scientist who's very respected. What do you think? Should I publish?" And Darwin was like, "Oh dear, this is my theory." The traditional narrative goes that Darwin was like, "Publish it. It does not matter at all that this is going to ruin my priority when I've been working on something for 25 years. Of course it should be published." Which is a little skeptical. And so I spent a lot of time digging into that and trying to see if there was possibility that Darwin was not as magnanimous as the traditional narrative goes, and I found that there was some evidence to suggest that the traditional story was not true. And so the whole play is kind of based around that. And so when I'm telling the Darwin story, I am pulling out words from specific letters that Darwin sent, like phrases from letters that Darwin sent to other people. I am looking for which letter was sent when. I'm looking into shipping schedules for freights going from the Malayan archipelago to London. I'm looking for what was the content of each letter. I'm looking for meetings mentioned in each letter. And I found some really cool evidence by going through those that helped fuel the play, which I will talk about very shortly. But the amount of information that I needed and how closely I needed it to resemble historical fact was very different than I was just writing about, some random people in the same time period that I had made up. So decide and define where you fall on this spectrum, because that will not only tell you how much research and what kind of research you need to do. It's almost like an increasing bar when you go this way. So here, there's a baseline amount of research you need to do for historical fiction. As you get closer and closer and closer to matching reality, you have to do more and more research. So you have to understand that, first of all, but also it's how much of your plot depends on the research that you do. I think my biggest tip for researching historical fiction is to not think of it as research, especially if you're over here on the spectrum. The research is really almost brainstorming for your story. A lot of my story elements, the way I thought it was going to be, completely changed when I started doing my research, and they got more and more exciting. So I would pick up on things or read a few sentences in a source describing the jail in Upper Canada. The just throwaway sentences, and I was like, oh my God, and that created a new plot point in my story. So you're really discovering. I've heard it described as trying to time travel. You're discovering. You're an adventurer, explorer. You're trying to find more information about these people so you can piece together how things go, so you can then piece together your story. Think of it as really looking for inspiration versus looking to ensure you have the details right. Because looking to ensure you have the details right is important, but that inspiration that you get from your research is even more important. And let's sort of define our goal with the research. Our goal with researching historical fiction is not to write a history textbook. And that can be something that's hard to remember sometimes for me as well, that I want to give all the details and tell you every little thing that was happening and explain to you exactly how the land in Canada was partitioned into like 4 different purposes. And nobody wants to read that. They want to hear about it. They want to feel it. They want to live it. They want to experience what having the land divided into these 4 things actually meant and how people felt about that. When you're reading historical fiction, you want to feel like you're immersed in that time. You want to feel the way the people felt in the time. So your research is also an exercise in empathy. It's inspiration because it gives you more ideas for what your characters were actually going through. With that in mind, let's talk about actually doing the research. Here is the secret. The internet at large, websites, suck for in-depth research. Google searches tend to bring up the most popular pages meant for the broadest audiences. And if you're trying to figure out, do I want to write in this time period or not? Do I want to write about this person or not? Google's great. Wikipedia is great. Read some of those popular articles. But once you've decided what you're going to write in, that kind of website, read about this, encyclopedia, is not going to be very helpful. All right, so to start broad and go deep, depending on what you need. It's important to remember the sort of iceberg concept for setting, which Brandon Sanderson talks about a lot, is that you know the tip of the iceberg and you just have to suggest that there's more to it than that, but you don't have to know the whole iceberg. So I don't have to know every single thing about 1837 Upper Canada. I just have to know the part that's relevant to my story. Just like world building and fantasy, you can't research every single thing. So to start at a broad level, you have sort of your initial searches to see if this is a time period you want to write about. Going on from there, you have to get an idea of what you don't know. So to understand what you don't know, I would suggest looking at books are a good start, books about the time period. If you're looking for things that are fast, children's education books, like books that are geared towards kids, are often very helpful. They're straightforward, they're easy to read, they're factual, and they have like lots of pictures so you can really imagine what it was like. Looking for books at your local library, looking for books on Google Books, just about the time period in general. One thing that I found really helpful are YouTube. If I Google morning routine or day in the life, and then I put the year or the time period, that will usually give a lot of results and is a great place to start. I have found that for more in-depth research, local libraries, local museums will have a lot of detail. They'll have stories of specific people who lived there. They will have documents, and that's incredibly helpful. Looking local is a lot better, I've found, than trying to just Google randomly global. So even if you don't have a specific town or something that you're thinking of setting your story in, you can choose one as a pseudo setting thing so you can really benefit from that local knowledge that will be there. So there are a lot of museums and like historical houses, at least in Canada, which you usually think of like Canada has historical houses. I can only imagine what it's like in England and other places like that. But these are incredibly, incredibly useful. If you can actually visit places where the story took place, or the museums that have elements from the time, or historical houses. I was lucky enough to go to a historical house of one of the leaders of the Canada 1837 rebellion. You can really understand and get a feel for what that time period was like. More than that, though, these houses or museums will often have primary artifacts or primary sources, so objects from that time period that you can use as inspiration. They will have supplemental materials and resources, and these places have experts. They have tour guides who know so much about whatever topic it is. They have curators who know wealth of knowledge, who are experts, and try to talk to those people. Those people will probably be more valuable than any book, any video you watch, because you can ask them specific questions. You can ask them for other experts, you can ask them for recommendations, and you can get the information. I got a private tour of the Mackenzie House in Toronto, and I asked this guy 15,000 questions, and they loved it because they wanted to talk about it because they know about it. That's their job. They're experts. Other ideas. When I was writing the Darwin books, the Darwin play, I found the Linnaean Society, which is where he premiered his work. And when I went to their website, I found a lot of information about how the society was run and the history of that society. So some of these things that are super old were around then, and they will have historical information and archives. So if there are specific things in your book, like a society or a house or a family, you can probably look up information in present day and see if they have archives for you. Library archives are also your friend. Lots of library archives, you can find primary sources, and primary sources are key, right? So the first things that I said, Google morning routines, look at resources, look at books, those are all secondary sources for the most part. Those are things that people have done a lot of research. they've put it together and they've presented it to you as an audience. Those are very helpful as a starting point. If you want to do really well, if you want to really get a feel for what people were feeling and thinking and doing in the time period, primary sources, which are from that time period, are key. These are things like maps, letters, newspapers, photos, old documents, clothes. There was a really beautiful embroidery piece that I found as a primary source. And library archives often will have a lot of these. There are often collections of letters from people who were important in a society. For example, there's a huge collection of Darwin's letters and other scientific letters that can be found on the internet. For Canada, I found a huge collection of letters from all of the sort of key players in the government from the 1830s. That was very surprising to me because these aren't names that people generally know. Everybody knows Darwin, but have you heard of Mary Drummer Powell? Because I hadn't before I started reading and researching. But Mary Drummer Powell of 1837 Upper Canada sent a lot of letters, and they are all at the library and you can access them. So you will be very surprised the number of primary sources that are actually available. It's just finding them that can be difficult. You can also try looking at scholarly articles or scholarly databases. If you're associated with a university or an alumni of a university, you might be able to still access their academic databases. You may also be able to access academic databases through your local library. Libraries are amazing. Go to libraries. Scholarly articles can be helpful. They're usually trying to prove a point or like argue some new connection or new insight, but it can be very relevant. Again, when I was researching the Darwin play, I was reading through a lot of scholarly articles because a lot of research has been done on, okay, who came up with this first? Was it fair? What were the differences between these theories? And that was helpful for me. So I'm doing a little case study here on some research that I was doing. This doesn't end up being a huge element of my novel, but I am still thinking about how it might tie in and if there could be a spin-off or even an event in the novel with this event. So I was looking through the Canadian Encyclopedia, which is like one of the 3 resources on Canada that you can get that are meant for general population. There's Wikipedia, there's the Canadian Encyclopedia, and then there's Canadian Bibliography, which goes into a lot more detail. And on the Canadian Encyclopedia, I was looking at Black history in Canada, and I saw an event in 1837. And basically the event was there was an escaped slave from the States, from Kentucky. His name is Solomon Mosby. He had arrived in Upper Canada, and then his owner came up from the States and wanted to take him back. So he was imprisoned in a jail here in Canada, and people were protesting. The Black Canadians and the Black women in Canada were very, very obviously against him being arrested and being allowed to be returned to the States. And so there was a huge sort of riot protest around the jailhouse, and they ended up saving Solomon Mosby. He escaped, he got away, but 2 Black Canadians were killed. So you get, that's a really interesting event in Canadian history. It brings up a lot of questions. It's not super clear. So then we turn to our primary sources. I was going through this primary source, which I've mentioned before on my channel, which is called Some Winter Wanderings and Summer Rambles or something like that. It's a primary source of a lady who was visiting England in 1837 because she was rich and she wanted to see it. I don't know. Anyways, there's a lot of problematic content in it, but she was there through half my book seeing events happen. And because she was sort of a patrician, she knew some of the governmental and leaders and such. So she kind of knew their thought processes. So I just randomly searched for jail in that PDF. It's been digitized, and search PDF, Control F works, which is amazing. And I found her recounting of the events where she explained kind of the background, which is that Upper Canada had a law that any escaped slaves were safe here. It was a safe haven. However, there was a loophole because there was a treaty with the US where the US could extradite criminals from Canada and bring them back. And Solomon Mosby had taken his owner's horse to get to Canada. By the time he got here, the horse was gone. And so that is why that loophole in that treaty was why he was imprisoned. And there was a whole debate going on that the Lieutenant Bondhead, or the governor of Canada, should have said, scrap the law, this is an escaped slave, the Safe Haven Act applies, especially because the Black Canadians raised over $1,000 to give to the owner to replace the horse, which cost $150. They were like amazing in this. Anyways, and he didn't. And her perspective in the book was like, yes, he really wishes he could help, but it's the law. And you're like, okay, I feel like that's not how Solomon Mosby felt. But anyways, you get the background, like the political background and that perspective. And I really wanted to hear more about the Black Canadians who saved him and the two who passed away. And I'm like, why are these not Canadian heroes for saving this escaped slave and ensuring he didn't have to go back? And I looked all around, I could not find their names. And finally, I found this house in Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's a historic house that was owned by some people in the 1830s, and they have a plaque on their website with sort of the story, and that is where I found the names of the preacher and the other man who were killed in the riot around the jailhouse to free Solomon Mosby, and I will put their names here because I cannot remember them at the moment. And so that was an example of how going from the sort of popular mass sort of information timeline to getting into a primary source to going local helped fill in the details of that story. We are on to part 3 of this video, which is about documenting the research. Documenting your research is so important. I cannot overestimate this, because the last thing that you want to be doing when you're trying to write your story, if you're in the zone, is being like, I know I read about this somewhere, what is happening? And that is what I did until this year. So I have been using Notion to store my research for my historical fiction, and I highly, highly, highly recommend Notion. I'm going to show you my Notion page here. The first thing I have on my Notion page, I have 2 separate pages. One I call 1837 info and one I call 1837 timeline. In the info section, I keep information about the time period in general. So for example, I have a whole bunch of information about Toronto, and Notion has this really cool toggle feature, so you can see a big list of things. So at the top, I have a quote from that Winter Wonders Summer Rambles primary source, which is reminding me that Toronto, only a few decades earlier, hadn't been a city at all, and it was actually occupied by the Mississauga Indians, Mississauga Indigenous people now. And then I have a whole bunch of categories into what things were like in Toronto. I have merriment, food, furniture, infrastructure, inn, parties, balls. And when I click on any of these, I have quotes in some of them. Again, I literally copied and pasted directly from the primary source. So some of these I've embedded pages, links. This is a link to a Google book that I found where I got a lot of my information. Here's a link to a scholarly article that I like because it tells the significance of the 1837 rebellion. And it goes on and on. You can also have tables, graphs, you can embed images, you can embed pages. And so I organize it like that, where I can see an overview, and if I want more detail, I can go in further. I also like to save the resources that I'm using here in a format that's easily accessible, where they're each categorized. Then I have my timeline. Again, if you're more on that side of the spectrum, you maybe don't need a timeline. You maybe only need to save historical info. And I really like this because my book is called 1837. It does really go from January to December of 1837. So I had to keep track of all sorts of events that were happening all throughout the year. So the best one to look at is December. So I can open up my December and I have all of the days of the week here. This is so helpful for me because I could not keep track of what was happening on what days. So let's press Monday because a lot of things happened on Monday and I can toggle even further in. So we had someone died in the rebellion and I have the whole backstory to why it happened right there. It's been so helpful to use Notion. And basically that's just an example of how I do it. But the takeaway from this is to really think and put some thought into how you are documenting your research and to ensure that you are documenting your research in the first place, because you gotta write it down. You are not going to remember. And the worst thing is being like, oh my God, was it Article 8 or Article 10 that had this detail that I want? And then you're scanning through and then you miss it in both articles because you're just scanning and it was like one sentence in the middle of that paragraph, in the middle of the third page, and nobody pays that much attention on the third page anyways. You know what I mean? So write things down. It's hard to know how much to write down versus how much to, like what notes to take. It really depends on your story, and that's why it's so important to define the information that you need in the first step so you can set up your documentation in this third step such that it will serve your purpose and serve your overall novel. So I love talking about historical fiction. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments what sort of sources you use if you're writing historical fiction, how you go about documenting it, and if you have any good historical fiction recommendations, whether it's a craft book, so for people who want to write, or whether it's to read. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.